Welcome, everyone. I want to welcome you to Recovering Wholeness Together with Lynn and Andrea. And I'm Andrea, and my pronouns are she, her. I live in Philadelphia, which is the traditional land of the Lenape people. Let's see, I am in recovery from alcohol, anxiety, disordered eating, loss, grief, lots of other things too. I'm a licensed professional counselor in Pennsylvania and New Jersey. I'm a certified professional recovery coach, Reiki Level 3 master practitioner, an artist, a mom of two boys who are both in college. And I want to introduce you to my good friend Lynn, who's going to welcome one of our very favorite guests back.
Thank you, Andrea. You always do that so beautifully. And we are celebrating the season that you can see with our little witch hats. We've decided we're going to make this an annual tradition since we're recording this just a couple of days before Halloween or Samhain or, All Saints Day, All Souls Day. There's Dia de los Muertos, lots of different festivities at this time of year. And we wanted to honor some of those traditions. I am Lynn Galliano. I am let's see, a wife, mother, grandmother, board certified behavior analyst. She Recovers Foundation coach, a Reiki Master practitioner, and Holy Fire lineage, and then a level 2 in Kaliki Reiki lineage. Um, and I live, let's see, in the San Francisco East Bay area, which is the traditional territory of the Bay Miwok people. I think I covered most of the things. Oh, I'm in recovery from alcohol use disorder, um, lack mentality, anxiety, adverse childhood experiences, and many more. So welcome everyone. And yes, I'm super excited to be speaking with Michaela Daystar today, who is somebody that I've known for a couple of years now, and she was our guest last year around the same time. So Michaela founded Heartscapes at the intersection of self-reflection, spiritual practice, and social action. After a 15-year career in social justice leadership, development in universities and organizations, wishing to support her clients and students to make their precious contribution to the world from the inside out, she teaches the systems of Reiki and soul collage as pathways to self-development, emotional resistance, and remembering our true self. In working with other Reiki practitioners, she also teaches trauma-informed principles to increase safety, trust, choice, and consent in our healing communities. Michaela continues her studies of Reiki and the Japanese Buddhist roots of the system, holds a master's degree in social justice leadership. Welcome back to our show, Michaela.
Thanks, Lynn and Andrea. It's always fun circling up with you, especially when you have sassy witch hats on.
Thank you.
hmm
So we thought maybe today we would I checked in with you and said, "Hey, would you like to come on the show?" And gratefully you accepted. And you came up with a topic that I really love because this is perfect for this time of year. And I'm going to summarize it and then maybe you can just expand on it. So, my summary is that we're going to talk about how to be with Reiki and integrity while being authentically ourselves. And that's a big thing for us in general. Like that's our form of recovery is recovering wholeness together means how to be authentically ourselves. Um, there's lots of influences, there's different cultural things that go on. We kind of sometimes feel the urge to bring all the things together for spiritual practice. Um, but you're going to talk about how to do that with respect to the different traditions and give us some strategies around that, I think.
Yeah, I hope to do that.
Awesome. Awesome. Thank
Um,
you.
yeah, absolutely. And I want to start, with one of the places that y'all started, which is to acknowledge that I am doing this work on the traditional land of the Patwin and the Lake Miwok people. And a simple awareness and acknowledgement of where we are in the world and who was here first,
Mhm.
and the complexity of the relationship between us is, I think, an important place for us to start, in this conversation. So I really appreciate that y'all have made that part of your culture here on the podcast. Um, when we're thinking about this question of how to hold a practice in this case, a spiritual practice, a healing practice that is firmly rooted in a culture that is not our own. And I'm speaking as an American, as a white American in Northern California. So the practice of Reiki is absolutely from a culture that is not my own. I have no lineage directly traced to Japan, unless we go back, millions of years. Um, there's some particular points of responsibility that I believe that we have when we're in that position that is not always part of our overall conversation as Reiki practitioners or just as Americans generally. And this particular responsibility and challenge that we have, of course, my kitten needed to join this conversation. It's
Yes.
my very most witchy familiar cat, Luna. So she'll be harassing me as we talk. Apparently, you're not supposed to be up here, honey.
Hi, Luna.
Um, so, this conversation really is rooted in the particularities of America. That's the perspective I am speaking from. So this conversation will have similarities, but show up differently for folks who are rooted in other places.
Right.
But the country of America has some particular sets of values, history, and mindsets around our identity that are important to acknowledge here at the start. We are a country that grew out of colonization, that grew out of the taking of land from people who were here already and had been for generations. And in bringing different peoples from different places here to this land, some of whom came here freely, some of whom were here because they were ejected from their places of origin, and of course, many of whom were brought here as enslaved peoples. We ended up with this kind of conglomeration of culture that was underneath the dominant lens of colonization. And we could talk for 5 years about that, but I'm going to focus my attention on our topic here today. And, all of that brought us a metaphor, a cultural national metaphor that has been helpful to us and that I think has also set us up for some challenges. And that is the metaphor of the melting pot. America is often called the melting pot, where different cultures come, they bring their uniqueness, and that all goes into one big cauldron and it gets boiled down. All of that uniqueness kind of blending together to create American culture, which, as many people have acknowledged, is a hard thing to actually define because of its fuzziness in that way.
Right.
But one way that it is defined is that our culture has been brought together from pieces from many other cultures. And oftentimes, perhaps even most often, those pieces were not given freely. They were plucked out of their origins. The parts that, in different points at different times, different groups of people felt were useful or interesting or valuable or exotic or sexy or beautiful, and they're taken out of their context and melted down here and blended with other things to create, whatever it is that we want. And there's a real, alluring creativity to that. There is it feels powerful to be able to draw from so many different traditions. And inherently, there is a cultural violence in it. And that's one of the many topics that gets wrestled with here in the United States. And people are going to have wide ranging perspectives on whether or not this is even a problem, whether what I just said is an issue at all. And then if so, what to do about it, particularly for white Americans who, have lineages that have, been the ones perpetrating this dynamic. So all of that is kind of the backdrop for this conversation, one of the backdrops, which is that the system of Reiki is such a system. The Western version that developed here in the United States, beginning in the 1940s, but really kind of catching its stride in the New Age movement of the 70s and 80s, is such a melting pot practice. The original form coming through from Japan was distilled, it was softened, it was secularized intentionally at first because of the context of World War II in which it came here.
Right.
And then through this kind of melting pot process that is so normal for us to do here. And the result is a very different system of practice than its original form. And unfortunately, increasingly, which is good, but generally not a lot of awareness of what that original form was and how it changed. So I feel like I just like lectured for like way too long. I'm going to pause right there and just see what piece is interesting for y'all before we kind of look at this in a little bit more detail and talk about how we can bring ourselves into good right standing with this.
Yeah, I really appreciate the context. I think it's so important to have that foundation when digging into these topics. And I know that Lynn mentioned you're going to offer us some real strategies. So for me, the theory, the lived experience, it's important to recognize that story. So thank
Yeah,
you.
absolutely.
It was great for me. I felt like I was back in an anthro class, and that was my undergrad major, cultural anthropology, and I really miss it. You and I could, talk for hours daily and never get through all of it, I think. So, really kind of grateful to get that background and lay the foundation. So we're all Reiki practitioners here. We're all people that have gone through college and had higher education, and we're all in various forms of our own personal recovery. So maybe what you could share with us is like kind of like as a spiritual practice, as white American women that have certain privilege, what what would be the strategies and steps for people that are in recovery of any background, kind of like be able to take that theory and break it down a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, yeah, as a recovering academic and a history major, it's like going into the lecture mode is really easy.
That's
Yeah,
great.
I appreciate, bringing it back to rooting it in recovery. Because I do feel that part of what is going on when we reach out and seek input from other cultures, a big part of that, especially again speaking as an American, is that we have lost a lot of our contact with our own lineages. We might know, which parts of the world our people immigrated from or were forcibly migrated from back in time. But many of us don't have an authentic, kind of heartful and knowledgeable connection with those lineages. And that was certainly the case for me for a long time. And that the anxiety of that and the feeling of loss, that's not super conscious a lot of the time, and the feeling of disconnection from our roots causes, I think, a sense of kind of anxious grasping for what feels like it nourishes us and feeds our soul. I think we do this unconsciously, and I think we do it for good reason because we need to feel a deeper connection, not only to our immediate community, but to our lineages. And so that's really, I think, where it begins for me is relationship. The antidote to this, or at least the breadcrumbs that get us on the path, is rooted in relationship with any of the practices that we're drawn to or that we want to incorporate into our life, and relationship with those that are connected to our history in some meaningful way. And that meaningful way can look a lot of different ways, but the easiest place to talk about at any rate is our own cultural ethnic lineages from our family. And so
Yeah.
I'll just, I'll share a little bit of kind of how I came to this. A little bit of storytelling might be a gentler way to lead in. I definitely had that experience of grasping for lineage for all of my life. I was raised in a way that was very agnostic around religion, spirituality, and culture. My parents were very much like, hey, go forth and figure it out for yourself, which gave me a lot of freedom. But it gave me very little direction, very little rootedness, and very little context of who I was in the world and who I might want to grow into. And in the absence of that information and, in a certain laziness to not do the work to go find out. Because I am, in a position where a lot of my ancestry is available to me. Like there's a lot of information that is available to me. And I've since done that work, but as a younger person, hadn't yet done that work. And what I ended up doing is almost inventing my own lineage. Um, I knew obviously from European ancestry, um, but I didn't know where exactly. And I just kind of grasped onto Irish culture as like the one that called my imagination the most. And to be honest, the one that had the most obvious kind of oppressed people status in the European realm. And there was a piece of my need to kind of be a good person and, not be aligned with colonizers as I was kind of building my education around those things that made me kind of attached to that. And for years and years and years, I strongly identified as an Irish descended person. And I spoke about it, talked about it, and that was my identity. And one day, when I was a grown person, like an adult, I said something about my Irish ancestry, and my mom just couldn't take it anymore. And she goes, "We're not Irish, right?" I was like, "What are you talking about? Of course we are." What? No sense at all. Of course we're Irish. It's like, no, like, I mean, we've got a lot of good European mutt, but like no documented Irish ancestry, right? We're primarily, at least on her side, Welsh, English,
Yeah.
Scotch Irish, which are Scottish folk who migrated throughout the British Isles, and, a little smattering of Scandinavian up there, but primarily Welsh and English. And this was terrible news because I had been trying to distance from the most obvious bad Europeans, right? That I knew were in my lineage, right? Which of course is reducing an entire people group, an entire history to
Right.
bad, you know. So, that kind of identity crisis really caused me to realize that I didn't actually know and I didn't actually have a good relationship with my ancestry. Now, by then I was already working with Reiki. I had already started practicing Reiki, probably in my first year, and was, learning the Western form. And I knew that it was a practice with Japanese origins that was shared with me. Um, and I knew a surface level decent amount about Japanese culture because my parents have some connections there. Um, and I grew up with a lot of kind of context of Japanese culture, and I wasn't seeing any of it in what I was learning about Reiki.
Mhm.
And there was this dissonance of like, I know it's Japanese, but we're learning about chakras, which are not Japanese, and we're learning about angels, which are not Japanese, and we're learning about, I mean, not in the form that we were learning. And there's these precepts that I'm told are important, but there's no context for why they're important or what we're supposed to do with them other than put them on the wall.
Yeah.
And there's these symbols and these mantras that I'm told what they mean, but not how they actually integrate into the system or where they came from. Um, and there was just all of these layers of disconnection between what I was told the lineage was and what I was actually learning about the modern form of the practice. And that dissonance became so uncomfortable that at a certain point I was going to give up practicing Reiki. I was like, this doesn't feel right. Like I don't, there's a groundwater here, both in terms of knowledge and information and spiritual experience that I am not touching. And I've been studying this for years, and through happenstance I found my way to resources that started to put those pieces of the puzzle together. And for me, what that did was allow me to begin to build relationship with this system of practice, with not only the practice generally, where did it come from, what is it actually rooted in, it didn't come out of nowhere, what is its own lineage. These all of these different elements that are there, symbols, mantras, precepts, breathing practices, hand placements, where did they come from? Why are they there in the system? What do they mean? Starting to put together those pieces allowed me to begin to develop and eventually really deepen my relationship with the practice. And for a while, I was very dogmatic about we have to do this as pure as possible, right? Kind of the pendulum swung hard in the other direction. There's no piece of anything Western that should be incorporated into this practice. And by then I was teaching. And so I felt the weight of responsibility appropriately. We should feel the weight of responsibility when we're teaching something, anything to anybody.
Right.
You know, taking on the role of a lineage bearer and handing it to other people. There is a great responsibility there. And I was really like, I have to do my very best to make this as pure as possible, which meant diving deep into the Buddhist roots, the Shinto roots of the system of Reiki. And I'm so grateful that I did that because it was fascinating. It made me more aligned and more in relationship with the practice itself. But then another source of dissatisfaction started coming in, which is that there were whole pieces of myself that then got left out, right? And there was a way in which I was representing myself as a lineage bearer to a lineage that I had, you know, superficial connection to, right? Studying and learning it from here. And there were pieces of other lineages that I hold that I knew had connection, spiritual connection, conceptual connection, ideas from different places that are synergistic with each other, which fascinates me. And so slowly those things started to creep in. And so I had to really think, how do I do this well? How do I stay in integrity with Reiki, having felt so out of integrity for so long, while still allowing pieces of myself to come in? So that's been the journey over the last 8 years of teaching Reiki. And I'll say that again, it really begins with relationship. Not only relationship with Reiki, but with those other parts of our lineage. Because as I said, I could have told you, I identify as a Celtically descended person, but I didn't know what that meant. I knew the Americanized version, right? I knew that there was a Samhain around Halloween and that there was a relationship, but I didn't know the details of how those elements became Halloween and the fact that every symbolic aspect of the tradition of Halloween is actually Celtic and has very specific cultural and spiritual meaning.
Yeah.
I didn't know those things, right?
Yeah.
And so what I realized is that I needed to be in better relationship with my own lineage if I was to represent and bear this lineage that wasn't my own in a way that was in integrity. So that's the next piece of the puzzle. And I'm going to pause there again. I
We
wonder
have
if any of
very,
that feels,
very, oh, go ahead,
I
sorry.
was just wondering if any of that feels familiar to either of you.
Totally. Andrea and I both have similar ancestry to you as well. And I've done my, ancestry DNA, and I do actually have some Irish, but other than that, I have the same exact, ancestry that you do. And, and I've had the same anxiety over it. Like, okay, I'm just a descendant of colonizers, and what, how, do I access the cultural traditions, the spiritual lineage of that ancestry, but really I feel more aligned with this over here, and how do I blend them together, and what do I do? And so this is why this is such an important topic to me, is that I still struggle. I feel like I should be. There's this like, voices on each side of me, like, you should be practicing Celtic, or you should be practicing, Norse pagan, or whatever, all of the different things that I have these voices for all of my lineage because of my DNA. But then what speaks to me most, and where my heart is called, is more of the Asian, the Buddhist, the Reiki, and I'm like, what does that mean? Like, so trying to put it all together is part of my recovery process, because it's about, who am I? Who do I need to show up in the world as? And how do I present that to others? How do I, be responsible for my own, identity, my own lineage? It just gets really muddy. So thank you
It's
for sharing that.
Yes, and I like that, the way that Lynn said, looking at this from the perspective of rootedness in recovery, right? The connections between Reiki as a practice and recovery. I think for me, my recovery has always been a spiritual practice. And, going back to 12-step meetings that I went to in my 20s, and I had no idea what I was doing. I just knew that I didn't want to drink again. And I was given these practices and this concept of a higher power. And some of those things really resonated for me because of my background. Um, but when Reiki came into my life, I was in a very different place in my recovery. And so this
Mm.
feels like this moment now feels like a new chapter. And I'm on the edge of my seat and excited to hear about where you went next with this because
Yeah,
I feel like I'm moving in a different, new, and exciting direction too.
yeah, yeah, I love it. Yeah, and like I said, I think that for many of us, and I think this is true for me, being driven to substances and other numbing behaviors um, is a response when we feel that sense of disconnection and emptiness and loneliness because we aren't rooted well in our lineages or any lineages. And so I do feel that this is part of healing ourselves, not only culturally as Americans, but also personally and in community. And so, for me, that as I said, that began with studying those roots and getting in good relationship with those elements of Reiki. And so I went, dived into learning about Shinto, which is the indigenous practices in Japan, and then Japanese forms of Buddhism, which came into the country in the 6th century and blended really beautifully with Shinto. And so those are, two of the most deepest roots that the system of Reiki then grew out of in the 1800s, early 1900s. And one thing I noticed immediately is that Shinto is it's a nature-based, animistic spiritual tradition that sees energy and spirit and the divine in all things and creation, and where being in relationship with the divine as it is presented to us in the world is central. Being in relationship with the trees as ancestors, as bearers of spirits, the rocks, the stones, the leaves, the rain, right? And so many, many, many deep, deep, deep layers of relationship to nature and viewing nature as not only alive in the obvious sense, but alive in the spiritual sense and our ancestry, right? And that we and the rocks and the rain and the trees and the kittens are the same kind of energy, right? We're the same kind of animated being that is drawn from a deep pool of life that exists everywhere. And that was beautiful and resonant and tickled my imagination in the same way that beginning to learn about my Celtic ancestry did, because there's so many similarities between those. Um, all of us come from people back in our lineage, if we go far enough back, who had this kind of intimate, both very practical and also very spiritual relationship with nature. And then that will get fleshed out in very culturally specific ways, but there's some commonalities. And I love that. Just, similar to you, Lynn, I didn't study cultural anthropology as my main focus, just a little bit, but I studied art history, and in that got really drawn into finding these parallels between cultures, widely different cultures where you'll see the same sorts of concepts, the same imagery, the same stories come through. And so that was obvious right away. And that became the entry point to begin to bring parts of myself into my teaching in ways that were authentic based on relationship with the two, and being able to articulate clearly what's similar and what's different and how they blend together in the um, depth of humanity, while also retaining their identity, retaining their sovereignty as culturally specific paths and traditions. Ultimately, that led to deep diving on the other side, right? So I mentioned I had this cultural identity crisis. I'm not Irish, you know. Um, and eventually I had to really confront the aversion that I had to looking at the English and Welsh side of my ancestry. And this is, I have learned, common for those of us who, Americans who hold a sense of guilt, a sense of, I don't know what to do with the fact that I come from people who have brought such violence into the world. I don't want to be associated with that, right? But in not wanting to be associated with it, we disconnect from our people in our lineage. We disrespect the people within those cultures who resisted colonization and violence. And we reject some of our responsibility for holding those pieces of our lineage and being part of the bioremediation, the cleansing of that lineage. And so, I really invite, viewers, if you're feeling any resonance with that aversion, or just simply the idea of not feeling well connected with your lineage, and if the idea of being in better relationship with your Reiki practice or any other practice that's from a lineage that's not yours, if that resonates, I really encourage you to dive deep into the parts of your own lineage that especially you feel averse to, that you feel that you would rather not look at. And so I needed some help for that. And so I did a program called Singing the Bones with the School for the Great Turning, which is Joanna Macy's school. Highly recommend 100% of everything that the School for the Great Turning offers into the world. Get it in your life. Joanna Macy is a precious, precious, incredible, brilliant teacher who just left this physical plane just a couple of months ago. And beautiful lineage bearers carrying her work forward. And one of them is a woman named Lydia Hartulian, who has, I believe, Lebanese lineage. And she and Leah Song teach Singing the Bones. They do it as an online class and then also as a retreat for people who've gone through the class. And it's a container for diving into your own culture for all the reasons that we've been talking about, and for connection among and between cultures. And they take a really valuable and powerful perspective on that. Firstly, their structure addresses the easy overwhelm that we can get when we look at an entire culture and history and say, I'm supposed to learn about that. It's like all of a sudden, thousands of years of information come flooding in when we like Google Welsh history, right? Welsh culture. They have a structure for helping you narrow down, finding one piece of culture that's your entry point, which I really appreciated and needed. And secondly, creating a very compassionate space for seeking those parts of our lineage that we are averse to because of any of the reasons that we've talked about. And one of the things that Lydia said early on is if you are a white person who feels ashamed of the colonizing aspects of your background and you have avoided looking at those parts, please understand that all of those cultures had people who were resisting, had parts of their culture that were not in agreement with what was being done, and created pockets of peace and connection and compassion and resistance to those things. And so that's a great place to start.
Yeah.
To feel those connections and to honor those people who may have, been erased by history, as is often the case when there's a dominant narrative. And that was so gentle and it was so compassionate and really worked for me. And so, knowing that I had felt this connection to Shinto, the animistic, nature-based side of things, and being a gardener and being a hobby herbalist, I was like, okay, plant medicine is the place to go in, right? Relationship to plants, but specifically plants that people are in relationship with around healing and medicine. And so I found right away a well-known myth within Welsh mythology called the Lady in the Lake. There's a different lady in the lake than the Arthurian Lady in the Lake. There's lots of ladies in lots of lakes all over the place that create mythology. And it's this tale of a herding a shepherd young man who sees a fairy woman come out of the lake and falls in love with her, and they make a bargain. She made a bargain with a fairy, which is always dangerous business. And they marry and they have a beautiful life. And he becomes wealthy because, of course, she's friends with all of the nature. So their farm is thriving. And the condition that he agreed to was to never strike her, to never hit her 3 times. The third time you're out. And over the course of their marriage, he hits her 3 times. And there's different versions of the stories. Some, those are striking her in anger. Others, it's like accidents, but even so, it counts. And on the third time, she's like, well, I'm out of here. She takes all the wealth and she goes back to the lake, back to the family, and he's destitute. And, side note, I very much appreciate the, embedding speaking out against, interpersonal violence that is in this story. But her children seek their mother at the lake. And she has a relationship with them independently. And she brings them all the knowledge of the healing plants of the world. And she gives them the plants and she gives them writings about how to use the plants. And they become the first physicians of Midve, which is the city that is where this lake is, that still exists. And this region is well known in Wales for the doctors that have come out of this town. And so those doctors are, traced back to this myth. And there's even some like genetic and family lineage stuff that really does like point to this farmer and his family, which is super fun. And so in that, I got to connect with my lineage. I got to do it through this part of culture that was so meaningful to me. And I got to play with the blending of that with what I was learning about Shinto. And I'll just point to one piece, well, two that are connected. One is the reverence of plants and the relationship to plants in the natural world. Two is the presence of divine beings. So in Celtic mythology, that would be the Fae, the fairies. And, they kind of warped into Christian spiritual forms when that transition happened. But the Fae, held the mystery of kind of divinity as personified in human and animal forms. And in Japan, we have the kami, the gods and goddesses, the spirits that inhabit all of the world. And they, have similarly interesting stories and ways of showing up with humans, being in relationship with humans in ways that are delightful. So this lovely kind of blending there. And then the last piece is the connection with water. That in Shinto practice, water is seen in many ways, but in particular as both a cleansing element and a connecting element. And we see that with the Lady of the Lake. She is the spirit of water. She is the fae of the lake, and she connects. She brings cleansing to the families and the region. She brings medicine. She brings healing as a representation of water. And so in kind of getting really granular and specific, one single myth, I now have like many books on like Welsh mythology and witchcraft and on that specific dynamic. There's actually the reproduction of the herbology, right? The book of herbs from Mythve that like is the oldest version of that. So like we know the specific plants that were used, and many of them were already growing in my garden, which made me cry so much when I read that. So we have this, connection there, and then this just really beautiful way in which these cultures that are so distinct, have these things in common, and that I could have relationship with both of them, and that it doesn't have to be so overwhelming, right? We can pick a single element of culture, a single element that's meaningful to us in our life here in wherever you are in the world in this year, 2025. What is it that sparks your imagination and your heart? Find it in those stories from your lineages and let that be the entry point. So I'm going to pause there before moving into another completely different example and just see what came up for y'all there.
What a beautiful synchronicity that some of those plants that you learned about were already growing in
Like
your
a
garden.
majority of them, like more than half of the
Yeah.
list in this book, this like ancient herbology. It was so
Yes.
cool.
That just makes me feel like, the ways that, one of the things that I think, especially around this time of year, that people think about a lot is intuition and mystery, with it, being Samhain and Scorpio season. And it's like you knew deep down that those were things that you needed before you even read the book. So
Yeah,
that's
yeah,
beautiful.
exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm excited to see how if it's your plan in this conversation to tie in. So I'm like right with you. Like, but here's my problem. I've got the Reiki side and the recovery side, and then I've got the Celtic, Welsh, English, like spirituality and cultural studies side. And I have a very hard time blending them together. I feel like I have to be practicing one or the other. So I would love to hear, because I think you do it. I think you have been able to like make it more of a holistic practice.
Yeah. Yeah. This is really, I mean, it's a huge question, right? Especially if we're aware of the pitfalls of, you know, teaching a practice without being in that relationship, right? Like there's an anxiety of doing it wrong that can
Mhm.
come in. And for me, in other areas of my life, that's definitely caused a like it has to be one or the other kind of division. And that's so painful because again, then we're leaving parts of ourself behind.
Right.
So I will say, first of all, not every part of who we are is going to appropriately come into our Reiki practice or teaching, right? There's plenty of parts of myself that just don't come in here at all. The ones that do, again, are the ones where there's some logical um, or intuitively known point of connection that already exists. I don't have to force it, right? The connection is there. And so, um, and water is one of them. So I incorporate a water ritual into my classes as part of our opening. And I talk about those two lineages, right? I talk about the relationship. I invite my students to find what does water mean in their lineages as well. It becomes a point of investigation and inquiry for them. Um, there doesn't always have to be a perfect, like one-to-one connection, say between our Reiki practice and whatever else we're wanting to blend. We can bring things in because they delight us and because they represent who we are or because they're fun, right? The key there is to explain, is to share with our students that this is coming from another lineage. It's here for this reason. It is not Reiki, right? It's me. It's something that matters to me and that feels like it would be supportive to us. And so it's here. Let me explain what it is and where it's from. It's not Reiki. So that's another way, that's another strategy. And I think all along in all of these instances, again, the deeper our own personal relationship with these elements is, the more fluid we can be talking about them, bringing them in and in a very non-judgmental, very normalizing way, just say, hey, this is coming from here. This is coming from here. Even the land acknowledgement, right? We are on land that is not Japan and is not Wales, right? And so we can acknowledge that, right? If we are in good relationship with the peoples of the land on which we live and work, then we can also learn elements from those cultures and name them, you know, paying attention to when there is a closed practice. It's another piece. I'm just going to side note here. I just want to acknowledge the phenomenon of closed practices. This is one of the things that when we're in relationship, we can understand and we can better know. There are parts of different cultures that are in a certain sense open for other people not of those cultures to participate or of those traditions to participate in. And many cultures are incredibly generous. They want themselves to be known and appreciated and to share what's beautiful. But in almost all cases, there's going to be aspects of those cultures that are closed, that are truly only available for those who have been initiated for one reason or another, either because that is their culture or because they have done the requisite work to have those practices open to them. So within Buddhism, that is part of the lineage of Reiki, a significant part. There are open and closed practices, right? And so that's a thing for us to pay attention to. It's a thing to ask when we're working with people from who are lineage bearers from other cultures. So I just wanted to name that. We do not want to bring into our Reiki practice a closed practice and to share it as if it's something that anybody is allowed to have. there's a lot of that can be a controversial conversation, right? There is a thread of thought, particularly in America, that nothing is close to me. If I'm interested in it, if I have access to it, if somebody's willing to tell it to me, what's the problem? I can have that. We can't. We're not entitled to everything. We're just not, right? So, wanted to name that piece. And let me get back on track. So, in terms of how to go from like these things have to be separate, it has to be one or the other, they can't coexist, relationship. That's where it begins. Feel your own relationship with both of these sides and get curious and imaginative on the threads that connect them and the parts that aren't directly connected. If it delights you, bring it in and put it into context for the people that are there. The practice of Gasho, coming through the Buddhist lineages of Reiki, is a beautiful practice for this. We can imagine the one thing and the other thing that feel opposite, and we can meditate on their connection and just with the breath, slowly bringing those hands together, feeling whether or not they want to come together. And this can actually be a discernment practice. If there's something you're like, I think maybe I want to do this activity in my Reiki class or with my clients, and I'm not sure if I should, this practice will allow your intuition and your body to tell you, right? Should it be brought in or am I ready to bring it in? Right. So that's a beautiful practice, which we could talk more about the specifics, super simple, but specific, using a Gasho practice to kind of integrate things that feel like they're opposite of each other. Yeah, I think that's my shortish answer to that question. Be in relationship, always provide context for what you're bringing into your classes and why. When something is not from the lineage of Reiki, name that, make sure people know, so that they can build their relationship with these practices in a way that is as informed as possible. Yeah. So, was that helpful then?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, yes, and I'm quiet because there's so much to think about, not because I don't have anything to say.
Yeah.
I just, I think there's a lot for us to consider, and I'm thinking about. I've created in my bedroom. I now have this like it's a bookshelf, but it's just altars, and so there's 5 cubby holes, and in each of the cubby holes is a different like practice and culture, and it's all one tower, but I've separated them. So I have my Shinto part, I have my Buddhist part, I have a very Judeo-Christian part, I have a Celtic part, and they're all in one bookshelf, but they have their own little nooks. And right now they
Yeah.
seem happy that way.
Yeah, yeah, I love that. That's a beautiful way to put that into your
Yeah.
space. And
Yeah.
and then you could use practices of like threads, going from like, here's a piece that's really similar. I love that. Um, and let's see, there was one other piece. Oh, language. Being careful about how, and this is we're all going to do it wrong. Like it's not perfection. Perfection is not the goal. Um, being mindful about the language that we use is a really important one. And I thought about that because over my shoulder here, there's this portrait of a mountain lion, if you can see it
Yeah,
right there.
beautiful.
So
Yeah.
I've always felt, spiritually connected to mountain lions. That same portrait is tattooed on my leg. Um, and for the longest time, I would use the terminology of like, that's my spirit animal, or that's, my totem. And, you know, becoming aware that that is languaging that comes from Indigenous American culture, and beginning to hear the request and sometimes the demand from Indigenous communities to not just use that language without having relationship with it. The term spirit animal gets bandied around in a lot of different ways that are not at all connected to the original intention. And that's a pain point for Indigenous communities. They would like us to not do that. And so I've thought about, okay, so then what is a word that can mean the same thing? I have a relationship with this animal on a spiritual level. And so what I've landed on for now, it might change, but is the language of the familiar, which is familiar, kind of coming through pagan traditions. And so like my kitten here is my living familiar, and the spirit of mountain lion is my spiritual familiar. And I love that because comes from family, it comes from relationship. Again, pointing us back to relationship, it's a word that feels more authentically mine, and it means the same thing, more or less. And it is honoring a direct request that has been made of me as a white American to not use the terminology spirit animal. So that's another piece is language. And that is tricky because colonization has pulled so much language from so many places. So we're never going to get it perfect. Never, ever. But it's something to pay attention to, right? And it's not that one person can represent an entire culture. But if we hear over and over again, or we hear even one time, hey, could you not do this or not use this word or not use this, or this is a closed practice, please do not use that. It's something to research, right? To see if there is a kind of a critical mass of that being true, and then to make the adjustment, because there's so much diversity in what we can use in our language and our practices that we don't have to use things that we're not welcome to. So that was another piece that came through. Okay. So do we have time for one more story, one more example? I know
Yeah, real
we're
quick.
getting,
Yeah,
we're getting
we're
completed.
getting close.
I know, it's horrible. Time is such a construct. Okay, so the Buddhist side so I talked about the Shinto side, connection to my Welsh lineage. The Buddhist side is connected, in my mind, most strongly to something completely different, which is my relationship with science fiction, specifically my relationship with the Star Wars stories. And I was born in July of 1977. The original Star Wars came out in March of 1977. Before I was 4 months old, I had experienced that movie 4 times. And the way in which so movie theater, all the sounds, that incredible John Williams score, all of the voices, all of the sci-fi sound effects, and in particular, Darth Vader's voice and ominous breath. Alongside crowds of people who were so excited and thrilled. They'd never seen anything like this before. Like the movie experience back then was so different than it is now. Just got in my body in a way that I can't even explain. Like, like the most deeply nostalgic, comforting experience from the sounds of those movies. And so like Star Wars is like my heart story. Like it is I'm so connected with that franchise, and I have deep roots there. And as a child, again raised by agnostics with no spiritual direction whatsoever, literally the Jedi religion and the Force was my first religion, like in a serious way. I was just like, the Force is real. Like Jedis are real.
Yeah.
This is how you think about the unseen world. It was my first language for thinking about the unseen world. And what I would then come to learn, I was also drawn to Buddhism and Asian spirituality, same as you, Lynn, partly because of my parents' interest in it. But I could clearly see once I started studying Buddhism that the religion of the Force is a approximation of Buddhist thought with a lot of mistakes, a lot of things that are incorrect about how George Lucas like appropriated Buddhism into the Star Wars franchise and the aesthetics of Japan. The verbal or the visual language of Star Wars is very much drawn from Japan. And so I use metaphors from Star Wars and other science fiction all the time in my teaching. Like I tell people, look, I'm a big nerd. It's gonna happen. I will be quoting sci-fi at you, okay? And that's another piece that I wasn't sure, like this is silly to bring this, American, whatever, like pop culture stuff into this, but more and more I'm just like, but it's me. It matters to me a whole lot. It's part of my personal, it literally was my first religion. There are meaningful metaphoric pieces from these I mean, stories, science fiction, fiction of any kind is a place where we digest and distill and communicate important real aspects of culture and spirit. So it's of value. And so I routinely will pull things from that world into my teaching, when it's meaningful, when it's relevant, when it's aligned with what we're teaching. And it delights me. And it often delights students because they're like, I know that quote, I get that reference. It's a point of connection between, all of these elements that's meaningful to me. So I just wanted to be sure to speak to the fact that culture can look a lot of different ways. It includes art, And that includes movies. So do quote your favorite movies in your Reiki classes and to your students if they're relevant and useful.
That is
That is
awesome.
such an inspiration to me. I love that, Michaela. I've been thinking a lot about my recovery journey as a whole, and all of the things that have always been meaningful or spiritual to me in my recovery. Um, and I think that recovery is the stories that we tell ourselves, right? Like there's stories that people tell us about us as we're, growing up and getting older. But for me, recovery, and this is something that I really try and talk about with my clients, is it's the story that we choose to tell ourselves about ourselves. And so I love the way you're drawing on all of these different traditions in a way that is uniquely you. And it does speak to the broad range of emotional experiences, right? Like we need joy, we need humor, we need laughter, we need creative expression. So I'm so glad that we got to that piece. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Yeah. I'm gonna just end like quick story because I have to share it because I'm never gonna have this opportunity again. I know you gotta go, Andrea. But when I was 10 years old, I think I was 10, I was in fifth grade. Yeah. And a classmate of mine who was in the next grade died. And at the time, I had grown up Christian Science, which is all about not going to doctors and a lot of prayer. That's a whole other story for another day. But I had been up the whole night. I knew that this kid was in the hospital and it was very serious. I'd been up the whole night praying for his recovery. And then he died the next day. And it was the first time I had ever known a child that died. And so I was just like done with Christianity at that point because I was like, wasn't me. I didn't fail. It was the system that failed. I knew enough to know like I had done my part, right? Like, and so, but I wasn't going to just become like a non-believer. And so that was right about the time when I was it was right after Star Wars had came out. I'm a little bit older than you. I was born in 70. And so I shifted to the Force. And so that was how I was able to get through that process, is that I then aligned myself with the Force. And I think that's why, much later in life, when I discovered Reiki, or Reiki came to me, it was so aligned because I had had this relationship with Star Wars that had gotten me through such a terrible moment in my life, right? And so Star Wars is definitely a very powerful, wonderful, mystical place to just live in when you need to. So
I
thank
wonder
you
how
for
many
bringing that up.
Buddhists were born from the Star Wars franchise.
That's it.
And then we have
Yes.
to unlearn some of the incorrect information
Right.
that's in
Right.
there.
Well, I want
Mm.
to kind of wrap it up. Andrea, any final words from you?
I just felt like this was such a gift to have you back. I could listen to you talk all day long. I think your students are so fortunate to have you in their life, Michaela, and thank you for taking some time to teach us about what's most important to you.
Absolutely. I appreciate it very much. If you'd like, I can send you some of the resources that I've mentioned. You can drop in the description and for people who want to follow that thread.
Thank you. I 100% agree with what Andrea said. I would love to have those resources. I wrote some of them down: Singing the Bones, Joanna Macy, Great Turning, and Book of Herbs, Welsh. I think that might have been Mara Starling. I'm not sure who was the author of that one that
This
you
one,
held up.
yeah, this
Yeah,
particular one.
yeah, she's great too. So yeah, thank you. Definite gas show here. Like it was really great to see you again, and thank you for all that you shared with us.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me back.
All
Thank you
right.
both.
Mhm.